Well, hello. Welcome to this episode of About Time with me, Chris Nichols. This is a series where I talk to people I've known over the years who've inspired me and influenced me and been my colleagues. And in this case, it's all of those things. And I'm so delighted that Eve Poole is with us. Dr. Eve Poole, hello.
Good morning. Good to see you.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant to see you. So for people who don't know you at all, I mean, how on earth do you go about introducing yourself these days?
Oh, I'm not sure I do really. I'm Canon Dr. Eve Poole, which is always a way to clear the room.
Now, what does that even mean, canon? I mean,
Well, I'm on the chapter, which is like the board at York Minster. So as part of that, you get called Canon and you have your own chair in York Minster. You have your own stall. So I can sort of turn up and robe and process and I always have a designated seat. So that's rather a treat. But yeah, it's a funny designation, really. The doctor, of course, I've got a degree in, I've got lots of degrees actually. How do I describe myself? I'm not sure. How would you describe me? Because you probably know me better than most.
I would describe you as an author, a CEO, a chair, and all-round good person, and my friend.
Ah, there. Well, thank you. That last one is the most important thing, of course.
Yeah. Huh. So we met quite a long time ago.
Yes.
Um, can you remember? I mean, when did you? Because we met in
I
Ashridge.
have quite a specific memory of meeting you upstairs in Fairhaven at Ashridge, and you're always my favourite colleague. And I remember being completely tickled because I was quite new and I had been recruited by someone who'd come from a consulting background. And I was slightly nervous because most of the other people I met seemed to have come from like HR and, all kinds of random companies I'd never heard of. And I remember feeling I'd met a kindred spirit when I met you because we'd had a lot of very similar experiences in our background and saw the world in a very similar way, which I think was hugely helpful. There's something very formative about that sort of big four, big five, big six, as it was in those days, probably consulting experience that, there were a number of us hired in at that time who had that sort of background. And I think it gave us a real edge. So I do remember that, instantly recognizing you, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you remember which year was it?
Well, I joined in 2002, so I imagine it must have been
Wow.
that autumn,
Okay.
um,
It must have been. Okay. So
time ago.
that is a while. Yeah. So in fact, I was probably just a year before you. I think I was recruited in 2000 and actually started in January 2001. So yeah, mm, yeah. Um, now we did lots of things at Ashridge, but the thing that I think shaped my world most was we worked together on a simulation, which you actually helped to create. I mean, that was one of the pivotal things I think in the history of Ashridge
Mm.
was the you did some research with Phil Hodgson and Melissa Carr and others. I mean, and there's such a good story in how that came about. Can you say something about it?
Yes. Well, I was the first woman to be hired into the leadership team, which was a bit of a shock move because we were still teaching rooms full of blokes who were in their 50s and I was, what, 30 or something. And so they would kind of look at me askance because I hadn't chaired Shell or done anything plausible. And in those days, you had to have your PowerPoints, and you had to have your PowerPoints on leadership, and it was always a load of pictures of Richard Branson, Nelson Mandela, and a load of old hogwash about management versus leadership. And I remember not feeling very confident about inhabiting that sort of presentation. And luckily, because Ashridge was in those days quite an old fashioned sort of place, they thought, oh, a junior person who is a girl, she will be able to come up with junior programs for junior people. And so it was thought that because we had lots of senior leadership programs, we probably ought to have something for more junior people who were aspiring to be leaders. And I thought, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, because of course in those days you did management programs until you were really very senior, and then suddenly you did a leadership program, and it cost double, of course. And it felt to me that was not plausible that you didn't become a leader until you were in your 50s and suddenly pressed a switch. So I got curious about what leadership really was, and I just couldn't find anything very sensible written about that. That there was you make the rules or you take the rules kind of nonsense around the leadership versus management stuff. But it didn't feel very practical to me. And I thought
Hmm.
I'd quite like people to know what it is they have to do. So we started off doing research into junior leadership, and just came up with a little hogwash that people had picked up on our courses about leadership versus management. So I thought, well, we need to just do something different And I remember probably something you were teaching about strategy in those days, something about the Sony Walkman strategy, which is that people couldn't imagine a small portable record player until they just created a prototype and people walked around with it and thought, what a good wheeze. So I thought, what we need to do is just create something and give people a go. And at that time, we were working with the BBC on strategy, and they had been working with the Stanford Research Institute on strategy. And one of the people we met through that showed me a paper about Merlin, and it was all about Merlin strategy, which was about sort of 2020 hindsight. Because, of course, in The Once and Future King, when Merlin and Arthur meet for the first time, Arthur is completely puzzled because Merlin is already expecting him and has laid breakfast. And Merlin explains it's because, unlike Arthur, who was born in the past and is living into the future, he was born in the future and is living life backwards. So, of course, he knew he was coming because he's already been. And it occurred to me that's what leaders need. They need 2020 foresight. And of course, all leadership books, all these autobiographies you see in bookshops are 2020 hindsight. And actually, people don't have 10 years to wait to be mugged by fate. They need to know now what it's going to be like so they can get cracking and learn the stuff. So, with that idea that what we were looking for was 2020 foresight, we kicked off this brilliant research question with everyone we could possibly get our hands on, which is anyone that we could find that was senior enough. So they needed to be board level. Didn't matter the sector or the industry or the geography or the gender, although, of course, statistically in those days, we started off mainly with blokes. We said, well, what do you know now about yourself as a leader that you wish you'd known 10 years ago? Because we figured that that sort of 10-year window would get us enough insight to be able to kind of switch that round and say, well, what would you need to learn now to have the muscle memory to be able to learn in that 10-year time frame? How would you get job ready so that nothing would scare you? And we just got such great information from that. At the same time, I was doing a lot of work with EQ, which was quite new in those days in terms of being taught on programs. There was some very basic neuroscience coming through at that stage, nothing very, that the MRI stuff hadn't kicked in yet, but there was some understandings emerging about how memory is formed and the different functions in the brain around amygdala learning and emotions and all that. That we figured out that what we needed to do was to sort of use shock tactics to get these lessons in at a deep enough level that they would become templates, they would become genuine instincts for leaders. They would have that muscle memory to be fearless in their leadership. So we figured out if we could take these, what I wish I'd known 10 years ago lessons and bung them in, then people would just be able to crack on. So that was where the simulation came from. And as you know, over time, we worked with Harvard, we worked with the neuroscience team at Reading to really hone it into something very sophisticated around how do you most efficiently help people to learn at that level so that they never forget it. And it was great. And I loved
Yeah,
working with you on that.
yeah. And I still see Patricia Riddell from
Yes.
from time to time,
Very
and she mentioned you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that simulation, which was known as off balance, I remember,
Yeah.
was something you and I worked on, and with Megan
Yes.
for years.
Long time.
And it was a terrific thing.
Well,
I
that's
think it
why
was
it was
called.
formative, because of course we know from our own research, particularly once we started wiring everyone up with heart monitors, that our hearts were going like the clappers throughout every single one of those. And so, unlike in individual participants who only did it once, we did it hundreds of times. So it'd be very surprising if our brains hadn't been rewired by the whole process.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm. And beyond that, you actually wrote this into a book, didn't you? Or at least you wrote a book which started with this and then went into your wider experience, which was leadersmithing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, you don't have a copy on your desk, do you, or something to wave around? You don't have to, don't worry.
I can
At
fetch.
all.
Hang on a sec.
Well, watch out for the tiger.
Yes. Do not expose the tiger. He's in the background. He's lurking. Anyway, this is Leader Smith.
Oh, yeah. Now that's a terrific book. Now it's quite a few years ago now, but I still recommend it to people, and it's obviously they can still get it. Um,
There's even packs of cards, which are very handy because
and yeah, so I'd love us to tell us. I'd love you to tell us something about the book and how because you used it for a long time in your work, and you had a company, or at least a go-to-market called leadersmithing, didn't you? So it's a strange word. What's it all about?
I was fed up with leadership because if you wander around London, all the statues are blokes with huge swords and guns and things. And leadership feels like something that it is that old-fashioned idea of leaders are born, and it's all about where you went to school and bloodlines, and and I'm absolutely clear that leaders are made. And leader smithing felt more of an articulation of what real leaders say, which is everyone suffers from imposter syndrome. Everyone can make it up as they go along. It feels a bit like trying to throw a pot on a wheel and it all going a bit wibbly wobbly and having to start again. And so the kind of daily remaking of your craft felt like more of what people actually need to be able to do. You can't just assume that you've got the badge and that's it. It's kind of painted by numbers. Every single day as a leader, you have to get up, you have to refigure it out, you have to keep being fabulous. And that sort of daily travail, as well as the craft that's implied and the kind of tools that you need and all of that everything that is ushered in by the idea of craft that leader smithing articulates better than leadership, I felt was more helpful for people.
Yeah.
So the book itself, I loitered for ages because we built this for Ashridge, and it was something that Ashridge was running, several a week. I gather, still doing so. And I was sort of hoping Ashridge might write the book because it was a number of us who were involved, and the program is still changing. But in spite of my sort of nagging, nothing had really happened. So eventually I thought, well, someone's got to write this damn thing because not everyone can afford the $5,000 or whatever it costs to come on one of these programs. And it feels selfish not to cash this stuff out in a way that people could, curate their own leadership journeys, understanding what it is that we're up to there. So I used it as an opportunity to summarize all the research we'd done and all the various stages around the cognitive leaps, as well as the sort of neuroscience that eventually came out of the work we did with Patricia, and also to bring back into it some of the help that we give people practically, which is if you've gone through the simulation and you realize you're crap at numbers or you're desperately nervous in front of the press, then there are craft skills that you can practice that will help you find that can be easy if you develop the facility for it. So the first half is all about articulating the critical incidents and the neuroscience behind the kind of technology, if you like, of the simulation. And then the second half of the book is just this pack of cards. It's basically saying, eye contact, feedback, coaching, kind of survey of all the things we found useful on all our leadership programs at Ashridge, and sort of in bite-sized chunks so that people can say, okay, I've got this critical incident coming up. I've got to pull a blinder at my AGM. What are the things I need to practice to make sure I'm fabulous at that? And then you pick your winning hand of all these different exercises that you could have a go at over the next few weeks to get yourself limber and ready, and away you go. So that's it. It's just leadership DIY, leader smithing in a box.
Brilliant. And we could spend the rest of this podcast talking about that, but while you were doing all of this, you were also doing a doctorate, and a doctorate wasn't about this at all. I mean, your doctorate was, you were doing theology, weren't you? And you were doing a critique of capitalism. And, you know, how come?
Well, to me, they're the sort of the same project, but maybe they're opposite sides of the coin. I mean, as you know, every time we were in the privilege of one of those little meeting rooms doing coaching with one of our participants, they would come up with the same stuff. I'd like to be a better leader, but it's the system, it's all too hard, and I can't possibly behave well because. So leadersmithing was about calling these people out and saying, look, it's not that hard. Of course, it's hard to do it regularly at scale, beautifully every single day, even when you're exhausted and you hate people. But actually, the elements of leading are not hard. You just need to get really, really good at them so that you have enough cognitive capacity to tailor. So that's fine. That fixes the sort of confidence issue around imposter syndrome. But what do you do if you're working in a system where you feel the odds are stacked against you and you can't influence it? And my theory of change has always been that you can absolutely change systems. You just need to know how the systems work and know what nudges would be appropriate. And so my PhD was a cunning setup because I knew the book I wanted to write, but I knew that if some random theologian who was a female to boot writing in economics came out with a book on capitalism, people would just say, well, what does she know? So I thought, well, if I get a scary PhD from a scary place, then they'll have to at least review it without, completely writing me off. So The Cambridge PhD was a device to buy me the right to write the book. So the PhD was Theology and Capitalism. The book itself was Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions. In between, I wrote a monograph, again, as part of my credentialization. So that when I finally wrote the book, it was much harder for people to say, well, what would she know? And the book was an articulation of where the rot set in terms of mindsets that were absolutely spot on in sort of 18th
Yeah.
century Europe, but which just don't really stand the test of time. And if you are able to rethink some of the assumptions that are made about the rules of capitalism, all of a sudden you see how you can shape the system, how you can influence the system, how you can have agency within it. So for me, even though they feel like they were completely random parallel tracks, they were answering the same question, which is how do leaders be fabulous and change the world? And you need to do that both at a systems level and at a kind of personal leadership level.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. I was thinking about you actually last week because I was at the Global Tipping Points conference
Yeah.
at Exeter University. And, obviously the science on global tipping points is absolutely horrible. I mean, horrendous. Um, and at the same time, there's some really quite positive tipping points coming about. But I was thinking, gosh, they could do with Eve here because some of the underpinning why why it's so hard to change this is exactly the stuff you've been working on.
Yeah.
But yet again, one of the things I see in academia is it's really easy for things to research to happen in an island that only references literature within that field. So there's a load of literature around tipping points that doesn't pick up on the literature that you're part of, or
Yeah.
yeah, mm,
Yeah, again,
yeah,
that'll be the interesting thing is to see if the academy can, because there's been a lot of talk there about interdisciplinarity and why we need to
mm,
do things in the round, but it's still not kicked in because of the way that universities function and promotions function and funding functions. And the universities that pull that off will just make leaps. It's a bit like looking at what's happening in AI. Robotics was about engineering and it was about a complete different department from mathematics, computing, and AI. And now that they're actually putting AI into robots, crikey, things are suddenly starting to travel. But again, it was because of academic silos that took so long to happen.
yes. No, of course, that's another of your fields, isn't it? You've been writing about robots and AI.
Yes,
What was
yeah.
your book? Robot Souls.
Robot souls, yeah, which is all the things we're not programming into AI and why that will come back to bite us if we don't address it soon. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're about, you know, 18 or so minutes into this, and I want to make sure that we give plenty of space for all the stuff you've done since Ashridge and since the doctorate, because you've had some of the most fantastic jobs with really interesting bosses. You're the only person I know who's had the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Princess Royal as bosses. Yeah, and you better say something about how does this come about? Because you were chair of Gordonstoun, weren't you? And you were on the I don't even know what it means. The
The third
third.
Church Estates Commissioner for
Yeah,
England.
what
That
on
gets
earth
people
is
used to.
this?
It's very
What
exciting.
is? So you better explain what
How
on
did it
earth are
happen?
those things?
Well,
Yeah.
I'd buggered off to have children. I'd stopped working full time at Ashridge in order to concentrate on that, and I was written toxic assumptions. I was starting to write lead smithing. It's very important to have a cover story when you have a career break as a woman. So I was doing books as a cover story while I had my twins, and I got phoned up one day by an old friend who said, "Could we have breakfast in the Athenaeum?" Of course, one never says no to breakfast in the Athenaeum, so I trotted along to see him. And he was on the board at Gordonstoun and was in charge of trying to hire a new chair. And he said, "Well, look, I know you've got a fantastic address book from Ashridge and everything else you've done. So can we just go through all the people you think ought to be chairman?" So we sat there and he got his notebook out and I sort of talked to all the people and he kept saying, no, no, too male, too pale, too stale, all that kind of thing. So I said, "Well, tell me about this place. What is this Gordonstoun?" I mean, we've all heard of it, haven't we? Called Jazz and the King and all that. But I didn't know very much about it. And he told me all about Kurt Hahn and character education. I was completely transfixed. So I made some suggestions and thought no more about it really. And then a few weeks later, I was phoned up by the headhunter to say, we need you on the shortlist because we can't find any women." Uh, and that happens ever so much, doesn't it? You have to be a stalking horse so that the headhunters look dreadful. And I kind of don't like pandering to it, but he was a mate, and I was intrigued, and I thought, well, why not really? They'd look me up on LinkedIn and thought like, it was plausible. So much to my shock and horror, after 300 trials by Shabley and millions of interviews and you know Princess Royal and stuff, all of a sudden I was the first female chair of Gordonstoun. I think they thought that I knew a lot from Deloitte and from Ashridge around leadership, and that I had done a lot of education myself, and that I knew enough about what they were really trying to do to be able to really help them articulate what character education really means in this century, particularly because of all the work we've done together on that simulation and leadership and character through my leadersmithing work. Um, and it was the adventure of my life, really. And I think most people write the leadership book after they've kind of had a fabulous career and got the OBE. I had already written the book, and it was quite odd. Suddenly, this academic who knew a lot theoretically about leadership had to actually do it. And
Yeah,
context where the slightest slip would immediately get you in the papers because Gordonstoun is very newsworthy. And of course, with
yeah,
Princess Royal working in that sort of context, it was very real. And it was a huge privilege to test this stuff. I mean, we sold it for years. We sold it to all of those people who came from Ashridge as absolutely the gospel truth, and it was incredibly encouraging to find that it was true. Everything we taught is true and actually works. So, and the
yeah.
evidence of that.
Uh, I'm I'm a Buddhist chaplain, so I attach myself to the Kamala Sutta in this one, which is it may not be true, but just try it and see.
It's useful anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm not discounting the experience that you found it to be true. That's brilliant. I'm delighted. Yeah. So what? I mean, you must have learned so much and have in those like what sticks with you as experiences in being a chair that really you take with you.
I think what I was most grateful for was all of those hours we spent on the simulation, because it was then that I really believed what we taught people about muscle memory. Um, I had to have some really difficult conversations, and I had sat through hours of difficult conversations with hundreds of actors, hundreds of participants,
Yes.
really difficult stuff. And that meant that I was incredibly fearless. And I think the thing I know about leadership now, viscerally, which I only knew theoretically before, is that you've got to make a decision, any decision, and you've got to be completely fearless. Any conversation that you have to have it. You can't be a coward about it. And I think most problems could be solved by one conversation. And I think what I learned from those hard yards, those years in the classroom, was how to do that. So I think I was able to tackle a lot of stuff that other people would have been afraid to tackle, because I knew I could, and that is precisely because of having had it programmed in through the work we did at Ashridge and the muscle memory. So I was hugely grateful for that, and it did really make me. I'm quite messianic about leadersmithing now, because it really is the
Mm,
that I found that works.
yeah.
Typically, if you have put in the hours of practice, you can do the media, you can do a staff room where you're having to announce redundancies, you can do meetings with survivors, you can carry off private audiences, you can do speech. I mean, there was nothing that I couldn't do there, because I knew I at least had the muscle memory, and what I had to do was to be able to have the capacity to pivot and tailor and respond to whatever was in the room, and that made me more present in those
Yeah,
moments than
brilliant.
I would otherwise have been able to be.
Fantastic. So we have to do the other one then. So that was the Princess Royal Gordonstoun one. So then you got and then the Archbishop. You got the
So
church
Gordon
estate.
gets you the portrait, and the third commissioner gets you who's who. And also, I was briefly in the birthday
Can I
list.
just say, yes, you were the first person I've actually worked with who became an all oil portrait on
I
the
love
wall.
painting.
You, I mean, well, literally, whatever else happens in the world, you say if some, you are an oil
I
painting on
love
the wall.
painting. But that is dead useful, because you know what? They ended up, they have to do it a bit before you actually leave. So I had that a sort of picture of that portrait from the artist, by my desk through most of the COVID calls, because of course we're all working from home. And I have never been more grateful for a portrait. I've got my picture of it here. This is a picture of the portrait, and I look quite terrifying. And this is so useful because every time I was completely flummoxed and having imposter syndrome and thinking, oh God, how will this end? No one knows. I would think, what would the portrait do? And as you can see, this person, she's frightfully wise, isn't she? And kind of, all that.
Oh, I think she could do anything.
The wall, in a place like Gordonstoun. So I would say, well, what would the portrait do? And the portrait would always come up with something frightfully wise. And I would just do it. So I absolutely recommend portraits because I think they're terribly handy.
Well, in these days, of course, we can all get an oil portrait knocked off by
Yeah.
some AI artist, so that's quite handy.
But also important. I mean, it was very interesting when I spoke to the portrait artist about it. She asked me what I wanted, and I thought, well, we could get into a spat about my nose or my complexion. I said, I want a little girl whose mum is bringing her up to Gordonstoun to see if it's the right school for her, to go into that scary room with the ridiculous carpets and furniture and all these oil paintings of all these terribly impressive old chaps. And I want them to see a picture of a woman who looks like she was a plausible chair, because then she'll think, oh, women are involved in this thing too. And so she was very wise, this lady. She said, well, I'll do you in blue because there was no blue in that room. And I'll do you in a square because all the other portraits are portraits. They're all sort of long. So
Right.
you go into that room and it's all red. And then there's this big blue square of a plausible looking female chair. And I think that's, portraits. You go into all these Oxbridge places, don't you? And think, oh, how ridiculous. But I'm a new fan of portraits if you can use them to signal diversity in that way. And that was really important.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the people on this series has been Edward Peck, who was Vice Chancellor of Nottingham Trent until recently, and has just gone to be head of the chair, rather, of the Office for Students.
Mm.
And as part of leaving, he, of course, becomes an oil portrait as
Yes.
well at Nottingham Trent. But because he is a 60-year-old white man, I guess he had to think carefully about how did he want it to be, because it could very easily have been another classic old bloke portrait. But whoever did it did a brilliant job, because it's Edward in front of a Nottingham Trent building with students milling about
Oh,
in the
good.
background, and Edward pointing at something in the building.
That's
It's nicely
remember
done.
when we first started at Ashridge, one of the things that you did as an icebreaker in all these desperate courses was everyone had to do a shield as a way of introducing themselves, and they had to sort of
Yes.
do a.
I never worked. I never worked on one of those courses. Actually, they wouldn't let me work on those courses. But,
It's a bit like that. I
so
think.
I never had a shield. You see.
Yeah, and I don't think I ever had to produce one of those dreaded things, but it is quite an interesting leadership uh, exercise to think, well, if I had to do a portrait that would tell people about who I am in this leadership role, what would I choose? Because it is quite telling, actually, what you would do. All my speeches, for instance, in my first year at Gordonstoun involved handbags, because I thought I've got to brazen out this being the first female chair thing. I'm not going to just pretend I'm a bloke who's got some lipstick on. And so I had a succession of quite extraordinary handbags, Rubik's Cube, one made from records, another one that was a heart. And I used them as my props to talk about things that really mattered at Gordonstoun. And of course, everyone can remember those speeches because they remember those damn handbags. And
Yeah.
it's really important in terms of the sort of stories that get told about you.
You have always been really good at that, because I also remember a TED talk you did, which was about the pearls. Pearls,
Yes, the pedals,
indeed.
the pals and the pedals.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
But you
So,
asked me
so
about working for archbishops. I should say more about.
yes.
So Third Church Estates Commissioner, I had been a graduate trainee in the Church Commissioners, who you may know as the sort of asset management function. They've got, I don't know, 10 billion or whatever it is they do. They farm for the Church of England these days, 11, I think it is now. So sort of asset management function. And the first Church Estates Commissioner, who in those days was the fabulous Loretta Minghella, is in charge of sort of wrangling the assets and chairing the assets committee and property committee and all that. The second Church Estates Commissioner is always a leading backbencher of the ruling party and does sort of parliamentary questions and stuff around matters to do with the church. And the third Church Estates Commissioner, which was me, has the sort of church brief. So I was the regulator for all the cathedrals. I paid for their deans and canons. I also paid for the bishops. I was the landlord of all their palaces. And also did all the sort of public hearings if we're closing churches or changing things around. And that was all quite complicated and fraught. Some stuff on parsonages. So loads of stuff, which was mainly lots of committees. I chaired a lot of committees. And during that season, I was also in charge of bringing through some legislation to change the regulation of cathedrals, because in those days, they didn't report to the Charity Commission. They only reported into me at the Church Commissioners. And it was felt that in this day and age, there ought to be a secular regulatory line as well. So we did quite a lot of horse trading with the Charity Commission and with Parliament to make sure they had that sort of dual accountability to church and to state. And so that was hugely fascinating, being involved in that whole process of bringing legislation from a kind of white paper through to actually getting royal assent. So that was intriguing. So now I'm a
Yeah.
expert in abstruse regulation, particularly the lines between ecclesiastical and secular legislation.
Yeah. And now you are a canon, so the current third Church Estates Commissioner responsible for paying you.
Yeah. Well, we only pay the residentiaries, and I'm a lay canon, so I don't get any money for that, of course, being a charity trustee. But yeah, it's
I
good.
didn't know. I
It's
didn't know you were a canon, so this is
it's
great news. I'm.
well, it's one of these lovely titles. I mean, who gets to be a canon? It's extraordinary. Yeah, so it's a real privilege actually to go back. And I mean, York Minster is obviously one of the larger cathedrals, and to have to enact the legislation I was responsible for is a real privilege, because you get to see if it actually works in practice. And generally it does, but there's quite a lot to be worked out in the changes that were made around who's in charge and accountability and governance. So that's been really good as well.
Yeah, yeah. So, so what are you doing these days?
Well, I wrote that book, the AI book that you mentioned. So I've been doing quite a lot of work on that, which is trying to cash out what it really means to be human and what we would need to do with our AI to make that work better. Having loads of really interesting conversations with the legal profession, with education, with loads of people, HR, L&D, about what AI will really mean. But I'm also doing another chair role, which is for the Woodard Corporation, which is it's probably about 50 schools all told. Some of them we own, which are independent schools, largely boarding co-ed ones. Some are academies, state schools down in England. We've got one in Wales. And some are affiliated schools who like us because we have a kind of Christian distinctiveness around us. And we help them with that. So it's quite a mixed ecology of different sorts of school, primary and secondary. And of course, at the moment, that's a sector that's in some turmoil. So I'm an exec chair, so I do that 3 days a week. And a lot of that is just sorting out governance, sorting out processes, and trying to just help all of those schools flourish. So that again is really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And are you still on the radio as well? Because I keep
Yeah, I
turning
do.
on Radio
I do.
Scotland, and
Yeah.
there you are.
Yeah, yeah. I tend to do more Radio Scotland than down south these days, and that's fun because I used to do quite a lot of thought for the day, and increasingly now I
Mm.
do Sunday mornings where they have you in for an hour just to talk about news items, and that is always a real challenge, because trying to attach some theology and ethics to whatever has come up in the news is a really great challenge, and I do enjoy radio because I can take in all my cards with me, and if you're on the telly you have to manage your expression, whereas on the radio you can make your faces and reading prompts, and it's a lovely medium to use. And I do a lot of podcasts, and I still write things. Yeah, so it's fun. It's a good mix.
Yeah. Mm. So, do you have a sense of what next? Because I'm sure with you, there's going to be something that is different to the other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think I'm poised to kind of write a bit more about leadersmithing, because do you remember there's this sort of tradition in business writing of field books? They write the book and then they write,
Yeah.
this
Mhm.
is what it's really like. And it feels to me that it is unusual to have written the book before I did the job. And they were two big jobs, the third commissioner and chairing Gordonstoun, and they happened during COVID. So it was quite a baptism of fire, and you did have to use the tools in anger. And I think there's probably more to be said, therefore, in terms of what the nuances around those critical incidents and what they really look like. Particularly because it occurs to me that when we were running all these leadership courses, even things like Top Leader Journey, we didn't spend a huge amount of time talking about boards. And when you
Yeah.
get into the boardroom, you realise that most of the things that happen to chief execs are because they've fallen out with their board or their chairman. Um, and there's really quite a lot to be done. It's not just all about managing the city. It's actually about how do you manage those quite complicated relationships. So I think I might write a bit more on that. I'm just trying to think that through. I mean, I think it has been the privilege of my life to do these leadership roles, and I think I have the tools to do them well, but I don't underestimate the cost. So working with the Church of England was really, really, really difficult because it's an operating environment that is theologically sexist, in that there is still a right for people in the Church of England to think that women ought not to have headship roles, whether they're ordained or lay. So I was chairing committees where I'd have members who didn't even respect my right to chair, let alone anything else. And so it was a very difficult environment to be a senior woman in. Um,
Yeah.
and I found that incredibly difficult and very, very stressful, because it was just very, very hard work trying to keep going when quite often you were just written off or ignored or, not respected. And decisions would be assumed to not be made if they'd been made by me. So everything was supposed.
And you say that's on, and that's not just on, because I could see that on institutional sexist grounds, but are you saying that it's theologically acceptable for people to say, no, I don't accept the authority of a woman for theological reasons?
Yes,
Is
in the Church of
that is
England, that
still
is
possible?
still possible. Is part of this
Oh,
mutual flourishing thing. And I did, for instance, I mean, I took some legal advice on this, of course, because you would in that environment. The Third Church States Commissioner has no legal personality. I was there to chair committees. So any decisions that were made had to either be delegated to be made by staff or they had to be made by committee. So, of course, none of my decisions, if you like, had any legal freight, unless the committee had delegated them to me. But my committees, of course, had decisions being made properly. Those decisions are absolutely ours to make. And there are a whole load of protocols, for pastoral schemes, you can be appealed to the Privy Council. There's lots of safeguards, but when a decision is made, a decision is made. But one thing that I found completely bizarre was how often bishops in particular would assume that my committee's decision was negotiable. And I would get all kinds of barracking, get hauled over to Lambeth to be carpeted by the Archbishop and told off. And there was a huge amount of bad behaviour and bad losers because it was assumed that, well, of course I must be wrong. And I kept having to sort of explain, you know, the legislation says this is the way the governance works, decisions are made. And so that was just sort of tedious, because as you know, in leadership, decisions just have to be made. Whether or not they're the right decision, you have to roll with the punches, you have to make them
but
work.
I mean, apart from this being just obviously plainly bonkers, there's also um, all the church estates commissioners at that point were women, weren't
Yes,
they?
I mean,
All three of
absolutely.
you were women.
I'm not sure you could see it. I can try and show you. There's a picture up there of all three of us on the very top. That was one of the
Yeah,
pictures made of this anomalous situation where all three of us were women. Um, so yeah, I mean, it was a huge privilege to be able to model,
yeah,
being female leadership at a lay level in the Church of England. But it was bewildering, perplexing, and ultimately ridiculous, that I had
yeah.
to work so very hard when it was very clear what my role was and what my remit was and what I was doing. So I found that a great way to learn how you do get decisions made and how to make sure your decisions are absolutely 300% sound because you know that they will be queried. And those are good lessons to learn. But ultimately, after 3 years, I'd had enough. I just couldn't cope with that sexism, and it was completely tedious, and it just stops you from doing your job well. So it has cured me of vanity jobs. I mean, I didn't do that just because it was a senior job. I did it because every inch of my CV was being applied in that role. But
Yes.
I think in future, if I'm invited to do any roles, I would do some serious due diligence about the senior people I'd be working with because it did teach me that you need to be free to actually do your role. And if there's going to be that sort of institutional interference, you just can't do a good job. It's that thing we used to say at Ashridge: you can't do good work for bad clients, but you can do bad work for good clients, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it limited what I could do in that role, because I was second guessed all the time, and that just became very wearing and very boring.
Yeah, I mean that's another version of Deeming's, a bad system gets a good person every time kind of thing, and
Yeah.
there's a limit to how
Yeah,
much
I was
water
sad
you
I
can
couldn't do it
push up
longer. I
a.
mean, I think all of us were sad that we
Yeah,
couldn't do it for longer because, as you'll
yeah.
see, it is now an all-male. Well, no, actually, Marsha, I think the new second Estates Commissioner is female, but it has gone back to the first and third being male. And I'm sure the bishops will find that much easier to deal with. So we'll
Uh,
see what happens with the new
yeah.
Archbishop.
Now we're probably in the last few minutes, Eve, and I just want to make sure I've given you space to like. Have I stopped you saying anything? Is there something you'd love to have talked about that we've like
Oh,
completely missed here?
I suppose I'd want to cherish you because I was thinking about what I've learned from you. And one of the things that I love is your curiosity. And it was one of the things that really encouraged me all those years ago when we first started working together is you're another person like me who doesn't stay in lane. And you're endlessly curious about other things that are going on in the world and how you can join the dots and connect things and cross domains. And I've always found that where innovation happens and where the good stuff is. And I found that really helpful. And I know you've kept doing that. You're endlessly curious, and you also don't just sort of dabble. You tend to get qualified in all the things that you're really fascinated by, so that you feel you have traction. And I love that about you. I love the fact that you always would know which books to read and what was going on. And I miss that about my Ashridge friends because I think there were a number of us doing very interesting things in those days, and that enriched all of us. So it's been great to watch you flourishing with Game Shift and to see all the fabulous work that's going on there because that really means something and it really matters. That ability to bring everything, all of us, into everything that we do and try and help more people to connect the dots because that's, I think, where the good stuff happens.
Oh well, thank you for that, Eve. Yeah, that means a lot. And um, I am endlessly curious. It's true, and I'm not sure that I'm qualified. But whatever it is I'm trying to do, I must be half qualified by now. So, yeah, and I'm not going to become an oil painting, I think, but um,
Well, you can do a painting of yourself because an excellent painter in your own right. So
well, yeah,
something
I can do so, I can do something abstract. I can abstract myself.
there you go.
So, yeah, but in many ways, this series, the About Time series, is a kind of oil painting of it's kind of making explicit some of the connections in my brain and my curiosity as a series. So I suppose in some ways there is a bit of a portrait in here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good. And I think
yeah,
that's really important. I think it's important. You've always done your thinking in public, and again, that is a huge contribution. Because few people are brave enough to do that. But actually, how other people think helps you understand how you think. And seeing that laid out and seeing the connections being made, I think, again, is hugely encouraging. So, really
yeah,
useful modeling on that.
yeah. Yeah, and you give me a brilliant idea. I think I will actually do a self-portrait in oil. So when people say to me, "Well, you're no oil painting," I'll be able to say,
So I think you'll find.
I think you find I am." All right, brilliant. Let me just say a couple of words to close this off, and I'll come back to say thank you properly. Everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of About Time. There are, as you will have noticed, loads of connections to other episodes. I do encourage you to dip into some of the others, but for now, Eve Poole, Canon Dr. Eve Poole. I'm just so thrilled you could do it. Thank you so
Thank you for
much
the
for
invitation. Love talking to you.
brilliant. See you again soon.
See you
Bye
soon.
bye.
Bye.